you'll see under our new life cycles, when we submitted the Maven component, it went through one of our predefined review processes, and inside of this review process, it defined what type of assets this review process applies to. What are the policies that should be adhered to, like the naming convention and the scanner policy that I showed you. And then you can see here the types of things that you can configure for each policies. There's a variety of policies that RAM comes with out of the box that you can configure, and you can create your own as well. You can also specify individual review board members, but let me show you instead some of the new capabilities we've added around Lifecycle in the latest release of Rational Asset Manager. You now have the ability to create custom lifecycles where you're able to specify your own states and transitions for each of the different types of assets you're trying to govern. So for example, I could have an open source release process, and I could specify the conditions that this would take effect. What types of assets, for example, that this would apply to. What categories, for example, or business units would it apply to? For example, I could have certain review processes based on a particular business domain, or geography, or enterprise architecture, or regulatory process. I could also add lifecycle managers. These are people that either I would like to collaborate with as part of the lifecycle review process by allowing them either to vote and approve the asset, or perhaps to simply comment on the asset. I search for the user and I can include them. I can then configure this further by specifying for each state and transition I can add additional collaborators. Perhaps I'd like Bob involved, Bob the analyst involved at the very beginning when we're identifying whether or not this is a common open source component that would make sense from a business perspective. I can specify whether or not he's allowed to edit the asset while it's in that state, or perhaps only review it. And I can also specify if the review process, the lifecycle asset, has to be reset back to the beginning at any point as part of the review and lifecycle of the asset. I have this flexibility at each of the different states. I can also specify what is required to transition the asset from one state to another, from a state of identified to scope. I can specify if certain policies must be adhered to, if there's a certain number of approvals or rejections required. All of these allow me full governance and control in an automated fashion, involving the right people at the right times in order to facilitate getting assets reviewed and approved and out to the wider population. Using this new Rational client, you're able to specify for each of the different types of workflows what are the states and transitions that are available and which ones are allowed or not allowed. You can also create and add and make your own new ones as well. So we've seen how Rational Asset Manager can be used to help automate the review process by automating reviews using policies. The next step is now for these development teams to begin using these assets. And as they begin to use these assets, you need to very quickly understand who's using those assets, how are they using them, control access to those assets, but also understand how these assets are related so that you can better understand the impact of making changes to be able to notify these teams about those assets. So in this next phase of the demo, we're going to show you how somebody in development can use these assets and then collaborate with others in the organization that also may be using those assets. And ultimately, the final stage, which is begin to report on not only the usage of the asset, but also repository-wide, understanding how assets are being used so you can better quantify ROI and allocate the resources in your organization to those assets that are delivering business value and away from those assets that aren't being used.